June 15, 1904, a Wednesday. New York City awoke to the kind of summer morning poets write about. The air was crisp with salt from the East River, the sun warm but gentle, and for the working-class families of the St. Mark's Evangelical Lutheran Church on East 6th Street, it was the most anticipated day of the year, the annual church picnic. It was more than just a picnic. For hundreds of German-American immigrants, it was a small escape. One bright day away from the crowded tenements of Little Germany, away from the clang of factories, away from poverty and struggle. Children rushed through the narrow streets with wicker baskets in hand, women packed sandwiches and cakes, and men joked about the long boat ride ahead. There was laughter, chatter, the sound of brass bands warming up, and the faint clatter of polished shoes on cobblestones. Their destination? Locust Grove, a green paradise on Long Island's North Shore. Their vessel? The pride of the Knickerbocker Steamboat Company, the SS General Slocum, a 235-foot sidewheel passenger steamer, painted white, and gold, glistening in the sunlight like a promise of joy. By 9 a.m., more than 2,300 passengers, mostly women and children, crowded the decks. The air buzzed with excitement, accordion tunes, laughter, and the soft creak of wood as the great paddle wheels began to churn the river. As the Slocum glided past the piers of Lower Manhattan, waving crowds watched from the shore. To them, it was a heartwarming sight, hundreds of families sailing toward happiness. But somewhere deep below deck, in the cargo hold where dust and grease collected over years of neglect, a tiny spark flickered. The General Slocum was a beautiful ship, but old. Built in 1891, she had seen more than a decade of service. Her paint was peeling, her hoses brittle, her lifeboats stuck to their racks from layers of thick paint. But no one cared to notice. Inspections were just formalities. Signed, stamped, forgotten. Safety drills were skipped. Life jackets hung in tidy rows, pristine and white, but stuffed with cork dust, which over the years had turned to powder. On paper, she was safe. In truth, she was a floating tinderbox. By the time the steamer reached the bend near Hell Gate, a narrow, turbulent stretch of the East River notorious for its dangerous currents, a few deckhands noticed smoke rising from the lower deck. At first, they thought little of it, maybe the engine, maybe a trash fire. But within minutes, the smoke thickened. The air grew sharp, acrid. A small flame licked at the wooden partitions, and then, as if fueled by the very wind, it roared to life. Someone shouted, "Fire! Fire below deck!" At first, it was chaos wrapped in disbelief. The band kept playing, passengers craned their necks, and mothers clutched their children, unsure what was happening. The crew rushed to unroll the fire hoses. But when they turned the valves, the rotten rubber burst apart in their hands. Water sprayed weakly for a second, then stopped altogether. The fire, meanwhile, raced forward, climbing stairwells, igniting the varnished wood, devouring curtains, benches, and hope. Panic took hold. Smoke filled the upper decks. Mothers screamed for their children. Passengers surged toward the railings, shouting for help that would never come. The captain, William Van Schaik, at first tried to steer toward a small island, North Brother Island, but the wind carried flames faster than the ship could move. People ran for life jackets, but the moment they hit the water, the cork dust inside disintegrated, and the jackets dragged them under. Lifeboats were seized by desperate hands, but they wouldn't budge, painted fast to the deck. In just 15 minutes, the General Slocum became a floating inferno. Fathers leaped into the river with their children. Mothers jumped holding babies in their arms. Some burned alive where they stood. The laughter, the music, the joy of the morning, all swallowed by the sound of fire and screams. From the shores of Manhattan, witnesses stood frozen, watching a nightmare unfold on the water. The East River, usually alive with ferries and barges, was now filled with smoke and debris, and bodies. And the worst part? Rescue boats were late. The nearest fire tug was miles away. By the time the General Slocum finally drifted onto the shore of North Brother Island, it was little more than a charred skeleton, still burning, still carrying hundreds of souls trapped below deck. Only 321 people survived. Over 1,000 perished. Most of them were women and children. The city was paralyzed. The newspapers called it the East River Holocaust. It was the deadliest disaster in New York's history, until September 11, 2001. But in 1904, as the smoke cleared and the bodies were laid in rows along the shore, few could comprehend what had just happened. Because what began as a day of joy had ended as one of the darkest tragedies in American history. And soon the questions would begin. Who allowed this ship to sail in such condition? Why were safety rules ignored? And why did New York's proudest steamer become its greatest grave? It was still early when the city began to stir. The sun had just started to climb over the East River, painting the rooftops of New York with soft golden light. For most of the city, it was an ordinary Wednesday. But for the German-American families of St. Mark's Evangelical Lutheran Church, this was the day they had waited for all year, the annual summer excursion. It wasn't just another trip. For these immigrant families, many of whom worked long hours in factories, laundries, and workshops, this single day was an escape from the grind. It was the one day they could breathe freely, laugh without worry, and feel, even for a few hours, that life was beautiful again. By 7 a.m., the narrow streets of Klein Deutschland, or Little Germany, were alive with chatter and color. The smell of freshly baked pretzels mixed with the scent of coffee and coal smoke. Children clung to their parents' hands, dressed in their best clothes, little girls in white dresses with ribbons, boys in sailor suits, mothers wearing wide hats and lace shawls. Fathers carried picnic baskets filled with sausages, bread, and homemade pies. The sound of laughter echoed through the neighborhood as neighbors greeted each other. "Guten Morgen," they said cheerfully. For one morning, the hardships of the immigrant life were forgotten. The SS General Slocum waited at the pier, gleaming in the sunlight. Its large paddle wheels glimmered like golden wings. The name, painted proudly across its bow, promised safety and grandeur. For many children, this was their first time on a ship, and they could barely contain their excitement. 8-year-old Anna Lieberman tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mama, will there be music on the boat?" she asked. Her mother smiled, fixing her daughter's hat. "Of course, Liebchen. There will be music and dancing, too." Nearby, Pastor George Haas, who organized the outing, stood with his congregation. His eyes sparkled with pride as he counted the growing crowd. For him, this day symbolized unity, a celebration of faith, family, and hope in a city that often made immigrants feel invisible. By 9 a.m., the pier was a sea of people. More than 1,300 passengers pressed shoulder to shoulder. The church band tuned their instruments. The air buzzed with conversation and laughter. Vendors sold lemonade and small flags, and the river sparkled beneath the summer sun. As the steamer's whistle blew, cheers erupted. The paddle wheels churned the water, sending up clouds of spray as the General Slocum pulled away from the dock. Hands waved from the pier. Children shouted farewells to those left behind. From the deck, the city looked magical. Manhattan's skyline shimmered through the morning haze, bridges arched like gates to another world, and the scent of salt and summer flowers carried across the water. The band struck up a cheerful march and passengers clapped in rhythm. Women set out food on tables, baskets of sandwiches, slices of cake, bottles of soda and beer. Children ran between benches, playing games, their laughter ringing across the deck. It was joy in its purest form, simple, honest, fleeting. At one corner of the deck, two young friends, Elise and Marta, both 12, leaned over the railing, daring each other to see who could touch the spray first. "Careful," Elise's older brother warned, smiling. "You'll fall in if you lean too far." They giggled, the kind of laughter that belongs only to those who have never known tragedy. For the adults, this was a rare moment of peace. Fathers smoked cigars and discussed work. Mothers shared stories of home, of Germany, of the old days before they crossed the ocean. Some reminisced about how they built new lives here in America, how they learned English, how their children now went to school in this strange, new world. There was pride in their voices. They were survivors of poverty, of displacement, of struggle. This trip was more than just a picnic. It was a symbol of how far they had come. Even Captain William Van Schaik at the helm seemed content. He had piloted the General Slocum for years and knew every twist of the East River. He greeted a few passengers warmly as the ship passed under the Williamsburg Bridge. "It's a fine day for sailing," he said to his first officer. Little did he know, this would be the last voyage of his career, and for most on board, the last day of their lives. As the Slocum glided toward Hell Gate, the most treacherous stretch of the East River, the passengers remained blissfully unaware of what lay beneath the laughter, a hidden danger, waiting silently below deck. The ship's fire hoses, unused for years, were brittle. The lifeboats were painted to the deck. The life vests, though neatly arranged, had rotted from within, their cork filling reduced to dust. The Slocum was a time bomb disguised as a holiday steamer. But on that morning, as children danced to the music and parents toasted to a perfect day, no one could have imagined that this ship, filled with so much joy, would soon become a floating grave. By 10 a.m., the Slocum was in full motion, its engines humming, its passengers singing, its decks glowing with sunlight. Anna Lieberman leaned against her mother's arm, her eyes half closed as the wind brushed her face. "Mama," she whispered, "I wish we could stay like this forever." And for one perfect moment, just before smoke began to rise from below, it felt like they truly could. The clock struck 10:20 a.m. when it began, quietly, invisibly. No explosion, no sudden chaos, just a thin, nearly invisible thread of smoke curling upward from the ship's lower deck. Below, in the forward storage compartment, barrels of straw, oily rags, and kerosene had been packed tightly together. Months of neglect had turned the hold into a tinderbox. And on that summer morning, as the ship rocked gently, a discarded match or a spark from the furnace found its way into that deadly mix. At first, the crew didn't notice. The band played on deck, passengers laughed and sang, and the General Slocum steamed confidently through the river's shimmering light. But deep below, hidden from sight, fire had begun to feed. Within minutes, the soft tendrils of smoke thickened into black plumes. The flames licked at the wooden beams, the air filling with the sharp, choking scent of burning oil. One crewman, John Coakley, descended the stairs, drawn by the smell. He froze. The sight before him was like something from a nightmare. The storage room was alive with fire, flames crawling up the walls, wood crackling, barrels bursting open as kerosene spilled like molten gold. "Fire! Fire below!" he screamed, stumbling back up the stairs. But his warning was swallowed by the laughter and music above deck. No one took him seriously at first. Fires happened sometimes. Small, manageable ones. There was always time to fix them. Or so they thought. By 10:25 a.m., the flames had doubled in size. The crew scrambled for the fire hoses, only to find them rotted, useless, their canvas crumbling at the touch. When they turned on the valve, the hose burst apart like paper, spraying water weakly across the deck. Panic flickered among the sailors. One shouted for buckets, another ran to alert the captain. But every passing second brought more heat, more smoke, more terror. The flames now climbed the stairs, racing toward the main deck, devouring everything in their path. On the upper deck, passengers began to smell something strange, acrid, heavy, unfamiliar. Mothers looked around nervously. A few fathers went to investigate. When they saw it, the thick black smoke pouring from the stairwell, a silence fell over the deck. For one brief, frozen moment, no one moved. Then someone screamed. Chaos erupted. Children began to cry, women clutched their babies, and men rushed to find a way out. But the fire spread faster than anyone could run. The dry wooden walls caught like kindling. Within minutes, the flames had leapt from one end of the ship to the other. The band stopped playing, instruments dropped to the deck. The air grew thick and unbearable, filled with screams and the roar of burning wood. Captain William Van Schaick, alerted by the commotion, burst onto the bridge. Smoke poured into his cabin. He looked out and saw hell. The entire forward section of the ship was burning. "Full speed ahead," he ordered desperately, his mind racing. His plan was to beach the ship, to reach shore before everyone was consumed. But that decision, meant to save lives, only fanned the flames harder as wind roared across the decks, feeding the inferno. The fire turned into a monster. On the lower deck, passengers were trapped. The narrow staircases were already engulfed, cutting off escape. Mothers tried to shield their children with wet cloths, but the smoke was merciless. People coughed, gasped, stumbled blindly through the heat. 8-year-old Anna Lieberman clung to her mother's dress, crying, "Mama, I can't breathe." Her mother lifted her up, tears streaming down her face. "Hold on, Anna. We'll get out, my darling. Just hold on." But when they reached the main stairwell, it was a wall of fire. The only way out was up. Some passengers began to jump overboard, believing the river below would save them, but few could swim, and the heavy clothing pulled them under within seconds. The current was strong, merciless. Those who stayed aboard faced something even worse. As the flames devoured the ship, the lifeboats, the passengers' last hope, were discovered to be bolted to the deck. The paint that sealed them for show had hardened into an unbreakable shell. Men clawed and kicked at the lifeboats, screaming in rage and despair. Nothing moved. The life vests, hanging neatly in racks, offered no salvation either. The cork inside them had rotted to dust. When passengers put them on and jumped, they sank instantly, disappearing beneath the dark water. All around the Slocum, the river began to fill with desperate shapes. People thrashing, crying for help, reaching out for one last breath. On board, the scene was indescribable. Children screamed for their parents. Fathers carried burning bodies in their arms. Mothers leapt into the water with their babies, choosing drowning over fire. And through it all, the ship kept moving, full speed, cutting through the waves like a torch across the river. The flames had reached the pilot house now. The captain could barely see, his uniform scorched, his skin blistering. He shouted to his helmsman, "Head for North Brother Island, it's our only chance." The helmsman nodded, coughing violently, eyes red from smoke. The ship turned, the paddle wheels still churning, leaving behind a trail of fire and floating debris. From the shores of Manhattan, people began to notice. Factory workers paused mid-shift, staring out at the river. They saw the smoke first, a black column rising into the blue sky, and then the terrible sight of a burning steamer, its decks swarming with people. "Dear God," one woman whispered, "that's the Slocum." The city could only watch in horror as the joyful excursion they had waved off just hours ago turned into one of the darkest tragedies in New York's history. The morning of laughter had become a morning of screams. The song of celebration had become the sound of fire and death. And within minutes, the General Slocum, once a symbol of joy and community, was nothing more than a burning coffin drifting toward its fate. The General Slocum was no longer a ship. It was a floating firestorm, a river of fire tearing its way up the East River, leaving behind a trail of smoke and screams. The flames, once confined below deck, now ruled every inch of the vessel. They raced along the wooden railings, devoured the lifeboats, and climbed the masts like serpents made of light. The white paint that once gleamed proudly under the morning sun was now melting, dripping into the water like wax. Passengers crowded the upper decks, trapped between fire and water, their faces blackened with soot and terror. From a distance, the sight was almost unreal. People on the shore watched as a bright orange inferno moved steadily up the river, the sound of crackling wood mixing with the faint echoes of desperate cries. But for those on board, it was a nightmare without escape. The heat was unbearable. Skin blistered, hair caught fire, clothing fused to flesh. Mothers tried to shield their children, pressing them close, whispering prayers that were drowned out by the roar of flames. Some clutched the railings, others screamed for help, but there was no one to hear them. Below, the paddle wheels kept turning, driving the ship forward through the dark smoke, as if the vessel itself refused to die. Captain Van Schaik stood on the bridge, his face streaked with sweat and ash. He could barely see through the smoke, but he knew one thing. If he didn't beach the ship soon, every soul aboard would be lost. He squinted through the haze and spotted North Brother Island, a small patch of green less than half a mile away. It was their only hope. "Hold on!" he shouted, his voice cracking. "We're going to the island!" But few heard him. The decks were chaos, people running in every direction, blinded by smoke, choking, stumbling, collapsing. Flames rolled across the planks, driven by the wind, cutting off paths to safety. The fire had now reached the engine room, and a violent explosion rocked the ship. Steam hissed from the ruptured pipes, and the deck above buckled. Women screamed as the floor tilted, sending people tumbling into the fire. Others were thrown into the water, their cries echoing across the river. The smell of burning wood and human flesh filled the air, and yet, amid the horror, acts of courage still flickered. A young sailor named James Kearney tied a rope to the railing and helped passengers climb down toward the water. He shouted for them to jump near the wake where the current was weaker. "Go, now!" he yelled. One by one, people leapt, some surviving, others disappearing instantly beneath the waves. In the water, a new nightmare awaited. The river, slick with oil and debris, caught fire wherever the flames touched it. The surface itself burned, creating a deadly ring around the ship. Those who jumped too close were swallowed by the flames. Mothers threw their children ahead, hoping they might float long enough for rescue boats to arrive. Many never resurfaced. A man clung to a wooden plank, his clothes smoldering, his voice hoarse from screaming. "Help us! Somebody, please!" But his cries faded as the ship moved farther up the river, leaving him behind in a sea of ash and fire. On the upper deck, a group of girls from St. Mark's Lutheran Sunday School huddled together, holding hands. They had been singing hymns just an hour earlier. Now, as the fire closed in, their voices trembled in prayer. One of them, 11-year-old Margaret Stokel, looked around desperately. "Where's my mother?" she cried. No answer. The smoke was too thick, the air too hot. When the flames reached them, she jumped. Witnesses on the shore later recalled seeing a small figure plunge into the water. A splash, a brief struggle, then nothing. The city of New York, meanwhile, was waking to horror. Factory whistles blew, and ferries stopped midstream as passengers pointed toward the burning steamer. The skyline shimmered behind a column of black smoke rising hundreds of feet into the sky. Boats from all directions began to race toward the Slocum. Tugboats, barges, even private rowboats. But they were still too far. By the time the first rescue boats reached the scene, the fire had consumed nearly everything. People were clinging to the sides, their clothes in flames, their voices barely human. Some rescuers pulled bodies from the water, limp, burned, unrecognizable. One tugboat captain later said, "I didn't know who was alive and who was dead. They all looked the same." Back on the bridge, Captain Van Schaik finally steered the Slocum toward the island. The hull scraped against the shallow sand, the impact throwing more passengers overboard. He stumbled out, half conscious, his face burned, his eyes red. Around him, people leapt into the shallows, crawling onto the rocks. Others floated motionless in the water. The ship was now nothing more than a skeleton. Its decks collapsed, its smokestacks gone, its hull glowing red from the heat. It was 10:55 a.m. when the General Slocum finally stopped moving. For those who made it to shore, the world was silent. The screams had faded. Only the crackle of dying flames and the lapping of the river remained. A few survivors sat in shock, their faces blank, staring at the smoking wreck just meters away. Others wandered the beach, calling out names that would never be answered. The river that once carried joy had turned into a graveyard, a place where laughter drowned and innocence burned. More than 1,000 souls had set out for a day of happiness. Now the East River carried their ashes downstream, silent witnesses to a tragedy that New York would struggle to comprehend for decades to come. Morning in New York City, June 15, 1904. A day that began like any other. Street vendors opened their stalls, carriages rolled down cobblestone roads, and the city's skyline shimmered above the East River. But within hours, a black column of smoke rose into the clear blue sky, so vast and dark that it could be seen from Brooklyn to the Bronx. At first, people thought a factory was on fire. Then came the whispers, then the panic. "It's the Slocum," someone said. "The steamboat, it's burning." And in that moment, the heart of the city stopped. The General Slocum wasn't just a vessel, it was a community on water. Nearly every passenger came from the Little Germany neighborhood of the Lower East Side, families, shopkeepers, teachers, and children who had lived, worked, and prayed together for generations. When news spread that the ship was in flames, the streets of the East Side filled with people running toward the docks. Mothers screamed the names of their children. Fathers pushed through the crowd, desperate for any information. "Please," one man shouted at a police officer near the East River Pier. "My wife and 3 daughters are on that boat." The officer didn't answer. He didn't know what to say. All anyone could see was the thick smoke curling up over the water, and the faint glow of flames in the distance. Downriver, at North Brother Island, the scene was one of unspeakable devastation. The island's small hospital, built to quarantine patients with infectious diseases, suddenly became the center of the largest maritime rescue effort in New York's history. Doctors and nurses who had been treating smallpox patients now rushed barefoot to the shore. They dragged survivors from the water, wrapped them in blankets, and laid them on the grass. Some were alive but silent. their eyes wide, unblinking. Others were burned beyond recognition, their voices reduced to whispers. One nurse later recalled, "I saw a mother clutching what she thought was her child, but it was only the child's dress, empty." By noon, rescue boats began returning to Manhattan, their decks piled with bodies. Crowds gathered at the docks, waiting, praying, refusing to believe. When the first bodies were laid out, a terrible silence fell. Some people screamed and fainted. Others simply knelt beside the lifeless forms, whispering names under their breath. "Do you see her? Look again. Maybe she's on the next one." But for most, there would be no next one. Within hours, hundreds of bodies lined the piers and morgues. The police had to commandeer local warehouses and ferry terminals to store the dead. The New York Times would later describe it as a city of mourning. Meanwhile, the East River still burned. Charred debris drifted toward the piers: shoes, prayer books, singed hats, bits of wood. Ferry passengers stood in stunned silence as they passed the blackened wreck. Some removed their hats in respect. Others wept openly. The Slocum had finally stopped smoldering near the shores of the Bronx, her frame half submerged, her smokestacks twisted and broken. Reporters arrived by the dozens. Cameras flashed. They captured images that would haunt New York for decades. The skeletal hull of the ship, the tiny shoes of children lined up on the beach, the faces of mothers who had lost everything. By evening, word had spread to every corner of the city. Church bells tolled, and newspapers rushed out extra editions with bold headlines. "Disaster on the East River, hundreds dead in steamboat fire." Mayor George McClellan declared a citywide emergency. Police and volunteers worked through the night, pulling more bodies from the river. Priests from St. Mark's Lutheran Church walked silently among the dead, performing last rites. One officer described it later. "I've seen death before, but never like this. The water was full of children." In Kleindeutschland, grief turned the neighborhood into a ghost town. Shops closed their doors. Flags hung at half-mast. Candles burned in nearly every window. Entire families were gone, wiped out in a single morning. At St. Mark's Church, the pews were empty. Only the pastor, Reverend George Haas, remained, sitting in silence before the altar where his congregation had once sung hymns together. He had lost his wife, his daughter, and nearly every member of his church community. In his diary, he wrote just one sentence: "God was on that boat, and he wept with them." The next day, New Yorkers woke to a city transformed by grief. Funeral processions filled the streets. Coffins stacked outside churches. Black drapes covered doors and windows. Even the city's toughened newspaper editors struggled to find words. It wasn't just a tragedy. It was an obliteration of a community. The fire had not only killed over 1,000 people, it had erased an entire way of life. The laughter, the music, the culture of Little Germany, all gone, swallowed by the river and the flames. And yet, amid the despair, questions began to rise. Why had the lifeboats not worked? Why were the life jackets made of cork and sawdust? And why had a ship carrying so many families not been inspected in years? The city grieved, but beneath that grief, anger was beginning to stir. The East River had claimed its dead. Now New York demanded to know who had let it happen. And as the smoke cleared over the blackened waters, investigators prepared to uncover a story far darker than anyone could have imagined. When the smoke finally cleared from the East River, New York stood face to face with the ruins of its own negligence. The General Slocum lay half-sunken and charred, a silent witness to one of the worst maritime disasters in American history. But behind the mourning and the public sorrow, something darker began to stir. A question that no one could ignore anymore. Who was responsible? In the days following the tragedy, investigators from the United States Steamboat Inspection Service were dispatched to examine what went wrong. What they found beneath the ashes was not just the wreck of a steamboat, but the wreck of a system built on corruption, greed, and complacency. The first discovery was horrifying. The Slocum's life preservers, hundreds of them, had been filled not with proper cork or buoyant material, but with granulated cork and iron weights. Many were more than 13 years old, rotted through, and useless. When passengers had strapped them on, believing they could float, they had unknowingly fastened anchors to their bodies. One inspector wrote bitterly, "They didn't to drown because they couldn't to swim. They drowned because the government said they were safe. Next came the lifeboats. Investigators found that none had been operational. Thick layers of paint had sealed them to the deck, making them impossible to move even in the direst emergency. The fire hoses, meant to douse any flames, crumbled to dust when tested. How could such a ship have ever been declared seaworthy? That's when the truth began to surface. The Steamboat Inspection Service, responsible for safety standards, had long been riddled with corruption. Inspectors routinely signed off on vessels without ever boarding them, accepting bribes and favors from shipping companies eager to save money. The Slocum was no exception. Her most recent inspection report, dated May 5, 1904, just weeks before the disaster, declared the ship fit for service. The inspector had never even tested the hoses or examined the life preservers. The report, investigators later found, had been copied from an older document, word for word. As evidence piled up, so did the outrage. Newspapers across the country published explosive headlines. Life preservers filled with iron, official negligence exposed. Children drowned by corruption. Public fury reached a boiling point. The same city that had mourned now demanded justice. In Washington, politicians scrambled to respond. President Theodore Roosevelt, known for his intolerance of corruption, ordered a full federal inquiry. "We must not allow this to pass," he said. "Those responsible will be brought to account." But justice, as the survivors would soon learn, was not that simple. During the hearings, Captain William Van Schaik, the Slocum's commander, took the stand. A seasoned sailor in his 60s, he sat stiffly, his face pale but composed. He admitted that when the fire broke out, he kept the ship moving forward, a decision that many experts would later call fatal. The logic, he said, was to steer toward a small beach on North Brother Island to run the ship aground. But in doing so, the wind fanned the flames faster, turning the vessel into a furnace before it could reach shore. When asked why no evacuation orders were given earlier, the captain's voice faltered. "There was panic. Everything happened so fast," he said. But for the families in the courtroom, it wasn't enough. As testimony continued, it became clear that the blame ran deeper than one man's poor decisions. The Knickerbocker Steamboat Company, which owned the Slocum, had long cut corners to save costs. Safety drills were never conducted. Crew members had never been trained for emergencies. Even the fire alarm system had been broken for months. The company's president denied responsibility. "The captain is the one in charge at sea," he said coldly. But behind closed doors, it was an open secret. The company had pressured inspectors to overlook violations in exchange for political favors. And then came the most damning revelation of all. A whistleblower from within the inspection service testified that several inspectors routinely signed safety certificates for bribes. He admitted under oath that some hadn't inspected a single steamboat in years. When asked if they had known about the Slocum's decaying equipment, his response sent shockwaves through the hearing room. "We all knew. Everyone knew. But no one cared until it burned." The court of public opinion was merciless. Editorials demanded accountability from both the government and the shipping industry. Thousands marched in silent protest through the streets of New York, carrying photographs of the victims, children, mothers, and elderly passengers, who had trusted a system that had betrayed them. Yet, despite the uproar, the outcome was tragically predictable. Only Captain Van Schaik was convicted, sentenced to 10 years in prison for criminal negligence. The company executives, inspectors, and government officials who had enabled the disaster all walked free. For years, survivors would remember his name as a symbol of misplaced justice. Because while the captain bore the punishment, the system that had allowed the tragedy to happen remained untouched. As months passed, the hearings ended, and the nation moved on. But in Little Germany, grief never faded. In the ruins of St. Mark's Lutheran Church, a memorial service was held for the victims. The Reverend spoke softly. They died not by God's will, but by man's greed. And as candles flickered across the pews, one could almost feel the weight of a city's guilt hanging in the air. The General Slocum disaster had revealed something far more painful than mechanical failure. It had exposed the moral decay of an entire system that valued money over human life. The East River would heal. The smoke would fade. But beneath the calm waters, the truth would never fully rest. Because every spark that burned on the Slocum wasn't just a fire, it was a reflection of the corruption that had already consumed those sworn to protect the innocent. When the flames of the General Slocum finally died and the wreck sank into the quiet current of the East River, the survivors were left drifting in another kind of wreckage, the wreckage of their own souls. For them, survival wasn't a blessing. It was a sentence. They had escaped the fire, yes, but only to be consumed by something far more enduring: guilt. In the days that followed, the east side of New York turned into a city of funerals. Coffins lined the streets. Churches echoed with cries that never seemed to stop. Mothers searched for their children among rows of unclaimed bodies, praying for miracles that never came. And among them stood the survivors, hollow-eyed, trembling, and silent. They didn't know what to say to the grieving families. How could they? Every glance, every whisper carried an unspoken question. Why you, and not them? Take Anna Klug, a 17-year-old girl who had leapt into the water moments before the Slocum's deck collapsed. She had lost her mother, her sister, and her best friend. Reporters surrounded her when she was rescued, calling her the miracle girl. But in every photograph taken of Anna, she never smiled. In one interview months later, she said quietly, "People keep saying I'm lucky, but when I close my eyes, all I see are faces. Faces I'll never see again." She stopped eating. She stopped speaking. By Christmas that year, she was gone too, found lifeless in her bed. The doctors called it ill health. Her father called it what it truly was: a broken heart. Across the East River in Kleindeutschland, or Little Germany, the tragedy had shattered more than lives. It shattered the entire community. Before the disaster, the neighborhood had been alive with music and laughter. Children played in the narrow streets, bakeries filled the air with the scent of warm bread, and German families gathered at St. Mark's Church, the same congregation that had chartered the doomed excursion. After the fire, it became a ghost town. So many fathers had lost their wives and children that they simply left, abandoning their homes, their shops, their language. Within a few years, Little Germany ceased to exist, its spirit buried with those who had died aboard the Slocum. For the survivors who stayed, the pain turned inward. Each night they dreamt of fire. They dreamt of screams echoing across the river. Some even dreamt of hands reaching out from the water, calling their names. One survivor, Friedrich Becker, told a journalist in 1905, "I hear them still. When the wind blows across the East River, I swear I can hear them calling for help." He never remarried, never took another ferry. He lived alone until his death, haunted by ghosts only he could see. The psychological scars ran deep, but society at the time didn't understand trauma. There was no word for PTSD, no counseling, no support groups. The survivors were expected to move on, to work, to rebuild. But how do you rebuild when everything that gave your life meaning has burned away? Many survivors turned to alcohol, some to faith, others simply disappeared into silence. One man, a baker named Karl Meissner, was found sitting by the East River every evening, staring at the water for hours. When asked why, he said, "My daughter is still there, somewhere below that current." It was as if the survivors were trapped between two worlds, alive in body, but lost in spirit. And then came the judgment. Newspapers began to twist the story, painting the German-American community as careless, even superstitious. Some editorials accused the passengers of panicking too quickly, of lacking discipline. It was a cruel irony. The victims were being blamed for their own deaths. One editorial headline read, "Could the tragedy have been avoided if they'd shown courage?" Courage? How could anyone speak of courage when the ship itself had betrayed them? When the life preservers were lies wrapped in canvas and the lifeboats were nailed to the deck? But prejudice was easier than compassion. To many in the city, these weren't just victims. They were immigrants, foreigners. The tragedy became another excuse to look away. And so, the survivors carried their burden alone. They gathered sometimes in small rooms above taverns or church basements, lighting candles for the ones they lost, whispering names into the smoke. For them, memory was both punishment and prayer. In one such meeting, a survivor named Margareta Engel, who had lost her husband and 3 children, stood up and said, "We live, but we are not alive. The river took everything, even the part of us that could feel joy." Her words hung heavy in the air, unchallenged. Years turned into decades, and the world moved on. The Titanic would sink 8 years later, drawing all the attention, all the headlines, all the history books. But for the survivors of the General Slocum, time didn't heal. It simply dulled the edges of a wound that never closed. They carried that June morning with them until their last breath. The smell of smoke, the sound of children crying, the sight of flames reflected on the river's surface. To the rest of New York, the fire became a story, a chapter in history. To the survivors, it was a life sentence. Even now, more than a century later, descendants of those who lived still speak of it in hushed tones. Not as a tale of tragedy, but as a lesson in what happens when human negligence meets human innocence. The survivors of the General Slocum were more than victims. They were witnesses to how easily a city can forget and how deeply one moment of indifference can scar generations. When a fire consumes a ship, it leaves behind ashes and wreckage. But when a tragedy consumes a community, what does it leave behind? For little Germany, the once vibrant heart of New York's German-American life, the answer was simple and devastating: emptiness. Before June 15, 1904, this neighborhood was alive with the pulse of belonging. From Avenue B to East 10th Street, the air carried the aroma of bratwurst and pretzels from corner bakeries. Accordions played in beer halls where workers sang folk songs after long factory shifts. Children ran through narrow cobblestone alleys, their laughter echoing off red brick walls. Every Sunday, families gathered at St. Mark's Evangelical Lutheran Church, the same congregation that would later board the doomed General Slocum for their annual picnic. That church wasn't just a building. It was the soul of the community, the anchor of faith, friendship, and familiarity in a foreign land. But after that morning on the East River, the songs stopped. The laughter, the festivals, the warmth, all vanished like smoke. The Slocum tragedy didn't just claim 1,021 lives. It ripped apart an entire way of life. 3 generations of German immigrants, mothers, daughters, sons, grandparents, were gone in a single morning. Every home lost someone. Every face carried grief. Funeral processions became a daily sight. Coffins rolled down Avenue B by the dozens, followed by crowds dressed in black. Priests fainted from exhaustion after performing hundreds of last rites. And as the grief deepened, the guilt followed. Many fathers who hadn't been on the trip, who had stayed back for work that morning, couldn't bear to walk past the empty beds of their children. Some turned to drink. Others vanished entirely, leaving the neighborhood behind like a ghost shedding its own shadow. Newspapers began calling the area the Mourning District. Once the pride of German immigration, it had become a graveyard of memories. Shops closed, schools emptied, families moved uptown to Yorkville, seeking distance from the memories that haunted every street corner. By 1906, entire blocks were deserted. The cheerful signs in German, Bäckerei, Apotheke, Metzgerei, began to disappear, replaced by Yiddish and Polish lettering as new immigrants moved in. The once proud Kleindeutschland slowly faded, swallowed by the city's relentless evolution. It was as if the East River fire had burned the community's identity right out of existence. Yet, amid the silence, a few tried to rebuild. St. Mark's Church reopened its doors just months after the tragedy. The surviving pastor, Reverend George Haas, spoke to a half-empty congregation, his voice trembling as he said, "God took our children, but he left us the duty to live, not in bitterness, but in remembrance." He organized charity drives, memorials, and Sunday schools for orphans left behind. But even he knew, the spirit that once filled those pews was gone. Many of the surviving members couldn't bear to return. For them, that church was no longer a house of God. It was a tomb. Still, there were flickers of hope. A group of young German-American women formed the Slocum Survivors Society, determined to keep the memory alive, to support each other, to give purpose to their pain. They met every year by the East River, lighting candles, reciting the names of those who perished, and throwing flowers into the water. In one of their letters written in 1910, a survivor named Martha Fisher wrote, "They say our neighborhood is dying, But maybe rebirth is not about rebuilding walls. Maybe it's about keeping the memory breathing. And in a way, she was right. While Little Germany could not rise again physically, it was reborn in remembrance. By the 1920s, the old neighborhood was unrecognizable. New immigrants had filled the empty buildings. The German bakeries had turned into delis. The beer halls became Yiddish theaters. To most New Yorkers, Little Germany was just another lost neighborhood, erased by time, absorbed by the city's constant change. But every June, a small group would still gather on the East River Pier. Survivors, their children, and even strangers who'd heard their stories. They would sing softly in German, their voices fragile but steady. Some brought photographs, yellowed and creased. Others brought flowers. For a few brief hours, Little Germany lived again. Not in buildings, but in memory. Over time, the Slocum disaster came to symbolize something much larger than itself. It wasn't just about one ship or one community. It was a reminder of how quickly negligence and indifference can destroy lives, and how a nation can forget the very people who built its foundations. Because while the Titanic's tragedy would later echo across the world, the General Slocum was New York's forgotten fire, buried under decades of silence. Today, if you walk through Tompkins Square Park, where Little Germany once thrived, you'll find a small stone monument tucked away under the trees. It's easy to miss, just a simple plaque with an inscription. In memory of those who perished in the burning of the steamboat General Slocum, June 15, 1904. No crowds, no flowers, no ceremony, just a quiet whisper of history. But if you stand there long enough, if you listen to the rustle of leaves and the hum of the East River breeze, you can almost hear it. The echo of laughter, music, and a language that once filled these streets. Little Germany may have died that summer, but its story still breathes in the soul of New York. Time is the greatest eraser of pain. It doesn't heal, it simply buries. And so, as the smoke of the General Slocum disaster faded over the East River, so too did the memory of the 1,021 lives lost that day. At first, the city mourned. Newspapers ran front-page headlines. Politicians promised reform. Crowds gathered along the waterfront to watch as divers pulled charred remains from the river's depths. But weeks turned into months, and slowly, the noise of tragedy was drowned out by the sound of a city moving on. New York, relentless, restless, ever hungry for the next story, forgot. It's hard to imagine today, but in 1904, the General Slocum disaster was the worst peacetime tragedy in U.S. history. More than 1,000 innocent men, women, and children, mostly from one tight-knit immigrant community, perished in broad daylight, within sight of Manhattan's crowded shores. Yet ask most people today, and they'll recall Titanic, Hindenburg, Challenger, but not General Slocum. Why? How does a disaster so catastrophic, so devastating, simply disappear from our collective memory? Part of the answer lies in who the victims were. They weren't wealthy travelers or famous passengers. They were working-class German immigrants, bakers, seamstresses, carpenters, and housewives. People whose names never made headlines before or after their deaths. And in the eyes of early 20th century America, immigrant grief didn't hold the same weight. The newspapers that once sensationalized the fire quickly shifted their focus. The Slocum story was too sad, too local, too ordinary. It didn't sell papers anymore. Soon it was replaced by new scandals, political debates, and the latest developments of a fast-changing century. There was also the uncomfortable truth. The city itself was complicit. Inspectors who had ignored the ship's violations, politicians who had accepted bribes to look the other way, even the church leaders and excursion organizers who failed to demand safety measures. Every layer of authority bore a stain of guilt. And so, as the years passed, silence became convenient. It was easier to forget than to confront responsibility. The official inquiries dragged on, producing little justice. The ship's captain, William Van Schick, served only a few years in prison before being pardoned by President Taft. Meanwhile, the victims' families, many now living in poverty, received almost nothing. By the 1910s, Little Germany had dissolved. The survivors had scattered across the city. Their children spoke English instead of German, eager to blend in and leave behind the shadow of tragedy. The memory of the Slocum fire became something whispered about, a wound too deep to reopen. Each passing year made it smaller in the eyes of history, until it was just another forgotten entry in the city's long list of disasters. Then came 1912, the year of the Titanic. The world watched as another ship met its fate, this time carrying the rich and powerful, the famous and influential. The Titanic's tragedy unfolded across telegraphs and headlines. Its survivors gave interviews. Its story became immortalized in art, books, and films. And in that shadow, General Slocum faded completely. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't cinematic. There were no millionaires, no orchestra playing as the ship sank, no icy Atlantic to romanticize. Just the screams of women and children in the blazing East River, and a city that turned away. By the mid-20th century, even the few who remembered the event grew old. Their stories went untold. World War I brought anti-German sentiment, and many survivors chose silence rather than persecution. By World War II, the younger generation barely even knew what had happened in their own families. For decades, there were no documentaries, no memorials, no national recognition. It was as if history had decided that the General Slocum belonged to the past, a tragedy too inconvenient to remember, too ordinary to glorify. But memory has a strange way of surviving. In 1991, a group of historians and descendants began pushing to restore the Slocum's place in American history. They dug through archives, interviewed families, and found forgotten graves in New York's Lutheran Cemetery. They discovered that beneath layers of silence, the story still lived, in diaries, in old photographs, in the fading testimonies of the last survivors. And when they shared those stories, something remarkable happened. People listened. The world realized that this wasn't just an old New York story. It was a human story, one of negligence, loss, resilience, and the fragility of memory itself. Today, at Tompkins Square Park, a small monument stands where Little Germany once thrived. Most passersby don't even notice it. But every June, on the anniversary of the disaster, a few gather, descendants, historians, and strangers moved by the forgotten fire. They light candles, read out the names of the dead, and cast flowers into the river, just as their ancestors did more than a century ago. And in that moment, for a fleeting instant, the forgotten voices return, the laughter of children, the hymns of the church choir, the echoes of a neighborhood that once believed it would live forever. The General Slocum may have been forgotten by history, but history, in its quiet way, always remembers those who refuse to be forgotten. History has a cruel pattern. We don't learn from tragedy, we repeat it. And the story of the General Slocum is one of those lessons that the world almost forgot to remember. 1,000 souls lost. Not in war, not in some faraway ocean, but within sight of New York's bustling skyline. Mothers, children, and entire families, erased in minutes because of greed, neglect, and complacency. But beneath the smoke and the silence, the General Slocum carries a truth that still matters, even today. Let's start with the most haunting question of all. Why did this happen? Because safety was secondary to profit. In 1904, the General Slocum was an old ship, over 13 years in service. Her hoses were rotten, her lifeboats stuck in place, and her life jackets stuffed with powdered cork that turned to stone inside their canvas covers. Everyone knew. Inspectors, crewmen, owners. But no one cared, because repairs cost money, and no one expected tragedy. That same arrogance, it when it happened to us, has followed humanity into every century since. From the Titanic in 1912, to Bhopal in 1984, to the Costa Concordia in 2012. Each time, the pattern is the same. Warnings ignored, corners cut, lives lost. And yet, each time, we promise, never again. Until it happens again. The General Slocum wasn't just a story of human error. It was a reflection of an era, a mirror showing the darker side of industrial progress. America was racing toward modernity, obsessed with innovation and expansion. But behind every gleaming skyline and steamboat was a system rotten with corruption. Safety inspections were sold for bribes. Officials turned a blind eye to outdated equipment. The owners of the Knickerbocker Steamboat Company walked free, untouched by guilt. Only the captain, William Van Schaik, became the scapegoat. a symbol of accountability in a society desperate to bury its own guilt. He was punished for negligence, yes, but he wasn't the only one at fault. The entire chain of command, from the inspectors to the company directors, shared that responsibility. And yet, most of them continued their careers, untouched, unrepentant. What does that tell us? That injustice thrives not because of evil men, but because of ordinary ones who look the other way. The fire on the General Slocum didn't start with a match. It started with years of apathy. Every unchecked box on an inspection form. Every bribe slipped into a pocket. Every worker who said, "It's not my job." Together, they built the inferno. And when the flames rose, they revealed not just a burning ship, but the cost of indifference. But there's another side to this story, one that speaks to resilience. Because even after the fire, after the funerals, after the silence, the survivors endured. They rebuilt their lives in fragments. Some moved away from New York. Others stayed and lived quietly, carrying their grief like a scar. One survivor, Adela Liebenau Wotherspoon, was just 6 months old when the tragedy struck. She lost her parents and siblings, yet lived to be over 100, spending her life telling the world not to forget. In her memory, and in the memory of all those lost, the Slocum became more than a disaster. It became a warning carved into history. A warning that progress without conscience is deadly. When you walk through Tompkins Square Park today, you might notice a small, weathered monument. Most people pass it without a glance. But etched into that stone are the names of hundreds, mothers, fathers, and children, once full of dreams and laughter. That monument doesn't just mourn the dead, it accuses the living. It asks a question: what have we learned? Because every modern tragedy, from factory fires to train derailments, echoes the same story. Different faces, different decades, same reasons: negligence, corruption, silence. We may have advanced in technology, but our moral compass still wavers when weighed against profit. The General Slocum teaches us that remembrance isn't enough. We have to question. We have to demand accountability. We have to refuse silence, even when it's uncomfortable. Because every time we forget, history prepares to repeat itself. And when we remember, truly remember, we give meaning to those who died. 120 years later, the East River flows quietly where the flames once roared. Boats pass by, unaware of the ghosts beneath. But if you stand by the water long enough and listen closely, it feels like the river still whispers their story, not in sorrow, but in warning. A reminder that safety isn't just about rules, it's about empathy. That human life should never be a line item on a company's ledger, and that progress means nothing if it forgets the people it's supposed to serve. The General Slocum is gone. The fire has long burned out, but the lessons it left behind are eternal. Because every tragedy, no matter how forgotten, carries a message for those willing to listen. And the message of the General Slocum is simple. When we value profit over people, when we choose silence over truth, we build our own fires. And sooner or later, they will burn us too.